Hey, welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Ian Shepherd, and if you're not familiar with Ian, Ian is a fantastic mastering engineer based out of the UK. He also runs the Production Advice blog, which you can find at productionadvice.co.uk, and he also hosts an amazing podcast called The Mastering Show, which is a great podcast for learning more about the process of mastering as well. So in today's episode, we definitely talk a lot about the mastering process and what you need to know if you are going to start mastering your own music or mastering music for other people. So we get into some of the common problems that a lot of people experience as they get into the mastering world. But then we also talk a lot about this concept of creating masters that have a lot of balance when it comes to dynamic range versus volume. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the Loudness Wars, and that's still very much a thing. And Ian is one of these people who is very vocal about the importance of having dynamic range and how you don't necessarily need to master very loud to create very impactful masters. And in this episode, we talk a lot about what it means to have masters that sound dynamic and why loudness doesn't really matter. And Ian makes a really compelling argument for why he prefers to make masters that are a little bit quieter than maybe some of the other commercial releases out there, but yet they still compete just as well. And really, at the end of the day, when it comes on to Spotify, it's all kind of the same anyway. So we get into a lot about the discussion of volume versus dynamics and what you need to know. We also talk a lot about the idea of translation and how that relates to your mixes and your masters, and what you should ultimately be listening for as you work on your tracks in order to ensure that your tracks translate properly. And when we're talking about translation, translation is a term that can often be misunderstood and confused for a bunch of different things. Ian does a great job of explaining what translation really entails and what you need to know to make sure that at the end of the day, when your song is played on one person's speakers versus another's, it sounds good no matter where you are. So this episode is full of tons of great advice. I think you're going to find this really helpful. If you're someone who is interested in mastering, or maybe you plan on hiring a mastering engineer, but you want to understand, how to best prepare your tracks for someone else to work on your stuff, you're definitely going to learn that in this episode. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Ian Shepherd, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. How's it going, man?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Of course. For people who might not be familiar with you, can you give us a little background on who you are, what you do, and ultimately like how you got into the industry and what you're working on these days?
So I'm a mastering engineer. I've been a mastering engineer for a long time, 25 years at this point. I was unusual because I jumped straight into it out of college, basically. Most people have like a career as a recording engineer or producer, maybe, or a musician, and then kind of move into mastering. But yeah, I sent out a bunch of letters right after college, kind of asking for work, and got this reply from what I thought was a cassette duplication facility. They were doing cassette duplication for people, but also they were recording the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. It had been a vinyl pressing plant. They downloaded the picture discs for like Madonna and Prince here in the UK back in the day, and they were looking for somebody to kind of start working in a new studio they'd built. So I kind of fell into that more or less by accident. And it was just super lucky because I did mastering, but I also did a bit of recording. I did some mixing. Then we moved into enhanced CDs where you were putting QuickTime videos on the end of a CD so that people could play it in their computer. CD is a round circular silver thing that used to have music on it.
I remember those hidden videos. It was always fun to get a CD and see if there was something special on there.
Yeah, exactly. So then that moved into DVD authoring, and we did some 5.1 mixing and mastering. And then I left that company to set up myself doing Blu-ray authoring. So again, surround sound, but at every stage the video quality got higher. And kind of just previous to that, I had started a blog, just kind of talking about my experiences as being a mastering engineer, kind of as an experiment to try and just see if it could get people interested in working with me. And I wrote a blog post about Metallica's Death Magnetic album, and how loud it was and how the fans were complaining. And it kind of went viral, fairly heavily viral for those days. And suddenly my little blog that nobody was reading had some regular readers. And it kind of went on from there. I moved into doing courses to help people because, I'm aware that I'm a mastering engineer. So I think if people want to get the best possible results, you should go to a mastering engineer. But I'm also aware that lots of people don't want to do that. Lots of us do this stuff because it's fun. And because we want to kind of have that creative satisfaction and that feeling of control. And so I knew there were people who were going to try and do this, and I wanted to help them do it as well as they could. So yeah, there are courses, there's a YouTube channel, there's now a podcast. I've done some plugins with meter plugs, all kinds of stuff, really just, based around, I mean, it's funny because my website is called Production Advice. And the idea when I set it up was to offer kind of pay-as-you-go production advice to people rather than hiring me as a producer for an entire album. It'd just be, we need help with this. Nobody liked that idea. It never took off. So I have this entire website built around that concept where mostly I talk about mastering. But that's okay. It's people know who I am, so they figure it out.
Yeah, sometimes you just gotta roll with whatever people are throwing at you, right? For me, it's like Master Your Mix. I originally started my website as like an online mastering thing, and then same thing. I had a blog on there to help people with their mixes, just so that would make the mastering process easy. And then that kind of picked up, and so I was like, well, Master Your Mix is kind of a good, like, you can go either way. So that's how it worked out for me. But yeah,
I mean, we could just swap URLs, right? And
yeah, we could.
No, it's fine. We're good.
Yeah. So as far as like getting started with mastering, like obviously it sounds like you applied for that job and they had a whole bunch of stuff going on there. So was that kind of where you learned the skill of mastering?
Was definitely where I learned the skill of mastering. Yeah. So prior to that, I'd done my degree in physics and music, but it was literally 50% a physics degree. So quantum mechanics and electronics and all the rest of it, and 50%, Bach, chorales and Mozart and Schoenberg and stuff. But there was this really cool kind of crossover acoustics section to that course, and there was a recording studio there. So I'd done some recording and mixing work there as part of that, and I'd also worked on the live sound crew for the University Students' Union. So pretty much multiple times a week they would have a band come into play, and I actually worked on some fairly big name acts at that point, just when they were kind of small, but that was, setting up the stage, rigging a PA, miking up drum. I learned a ton of how to coil a cable, all that stuff I learned there. But when I started at SRT, which is the mastering company, I didn't know anything about mastering really. So yeah, I started off copying tapes, got some mentoring. I mean, it's funny at the time. So back in the day, you needed about £500,000 worth of gear to actually produce the master tape that would be used to make a CD. That was the only way to get something onto a CD. Things have changed, clearly. So this company had 2 of those setups, but I was in the new third studio that didn't have that. So I actually had to master from the little digital audio tapes, DAT tapes, the kind of about so big, from one to another, or from CD or vinyl or whatever, reel to reel, whatever the source was, onto one of these DAT tapes. That became the master, but that was then copied to U-matic tape, which was the CD master tape in another studio. And at the time, that was really frustrating to me because I was young and arrogant, and I was like, why won't they give me the power? But with hindsight, I realized that was a gift, right? Because I was basically given free rein to do what the heck I liked, but I had a safety net. I had an experienced engineer listening through to everything that I did. And most of the time it was fine. And then every so often it'd be like, you might want to look at that one again, or I noticed this problem with that, or, can we, revisit this? So yeah, it was just this amazing opportunity really to have kind of built-in mentorship without sort of having somebody breathing down my neck, or kind of watching every move. And yeah, with hindsight, I was actually mastering stuff for real within months of starting there and working with clients within the first year. And which doesn't, at the time I thought I know it. And of course, now 25 years later, I know I still don't know it all. There's always stuff to learn and kind of find out. But it was an amazing kind of basis, groundwork to get me started.
Yeah. No, I love that. And that sounds like a pretty great opportunity for you to like kind of go through that trial and error for yourself, but still have someone in your back pocket that you can go to for advice. And so I'm curious to know, like, I know that these days you work with a lot of aspiring mastering engineers and you're teaching people that process as well. So looking at maybe your students currently, like, what are some of the biggest issues that you see with people mastering maybe their own material or just getting started with mastering? What are some of those common mistakes?
Wow, it's a huge range, honestly. In terms of the people I talk to, there are people who come to me to do my courses who literally, they're almost there. Really all they need is a kind of sign off. They just want confirmation that what they're doing is, but then you take it right back. And there are people, somebody once sent me a mix to listen to, and the vocals were all in the left channel. And they weren't going for that kind of vintage 60s Beatles sound. They hadn't realized that was probably not the way that most people would want to mix it. So between those two extremes, there's almost anything you can mention. I think one of the common misconceptions, I would say, there's a lot of misconceptions about loudness that we could get into, but it's kind of its own topic. But one of them is just, for me, mastering, the whole point is you have bespoke settings for every song in an album, in a group of songs, in an EP, whatever it is, right? So I start from fresh with new EQ, new dynamics processing if it's needed, different amounts of limiting, maybe different limiters, maybe different types of EQ or compressors, maybe, one thing I might have stereo width tweaking, the other one I might not. Maybe every so often I'll use some saturation or some tape emulation or something, and it's different for every song. It's what every song requires. Whereas I see lots of people, I literally saw a post on social media just this last week from somebody kind of saying, I haven't found the one-size-fits-all mastering thing that's going to work for me. I want to just put it on my mix bus and be done. And I'm thinking, I understand why somebody would want to do that, but you're just missing the whole opportunity of mastering. For me, the whole thing about mastering, a lot of it is mindset, is taking a step back, looking at away from the mix, away from that whole, how loud is the kick drum? What should the guitar panning be? All that kind of stuff. And just kind of, how does this song relate to that song? How do they sit together? What's the flow? Am I maintaining the energy? Does it feel right? All that kind of stuff. And it's big picture stuff. And when you treat each song individually, you've got this opportunity to just, even in a project where the moves are very small, when you add them all up over 10 or 12 songs for an album, say, the change in the overall impact of the album can be huge, even if it was very close sonically to begin with. So I think that's, something that is a revelation to lots of people. And I think maybe the other thing is people are surprised that my approach, I really encourage simplicity and minimalism, which is not to say there are projects where I had one where I was using level automation to balance the amount of dynamics in different sections of the song. And I literally had automation moves of plus and minus 10 dBs at some point, so I'm not going to hold back if something needs what it needs. And if it doesn't work, clearly it's always better to go back to the mix, but sometimes that isn't an option. But in an ideal world, for maybe 80 or 90% of the stuff I do, it's just EQ, compression, and limiting, right? And it's gentle EQ, gentle compression, and very little limiting. So it's very, very simple. So I have people come to me with plugin chains, 7, 8, 10, 12 plugins in the chain, and to me, it feels like they're all fighting against each other. They do one thing and then they correct it with another thing, and then it just goes, and I kind of get rid of all of that stuff, put in one EQ and one compressor, and can very often get a result that I prefer and that they prefer, with just a fraction of the processing. So I think that is another thing that I think people come to mastering with this idea that it's kind of got to be huge and super involved. And for me, that's not always true. Sometimes it is, but not always.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. And I think that part of the reason behind that and why people overcomplicate is often because these days there's so many plugins being marketed as mastering plugins that have all sorts of different processing in them. Like they have the EQ, compression, limiting, saturation, AI, wideners, all that kind of stuff. So people see all of these features in the plugins and they're like, well, that's what a mastering plugin must, that's what a mastering engineer must use if it's all in this plugin. So they feel this need to incorporate all of that. But I love how you just kind of took it as like, sometimes you just have to be simple with it. Like start as simple as you can. And that's one of the things that I do really admire about your process from having watched what you do. Like you do try to keep things as bare bones as possible. And it often does result in a much better sound.
I think so. I mean, like I say, I think the trouble with too many things working against each other. I mean, just imagine you put in a low shelf boost on one EQ and then you listen to it, you think, oh, it sounds a bit muddy. I'm going to scoop some of that out. So you put in another EQ and you have a dip. And then you start thinking about something else, and you almost forget you've got those two EQs. They're still kind of sitting there in the chain, but you've got to remember, okay, one of those is working against it. And then you end up adding some of that bass back in or with another EQ, and I think having everything in one, especially with a modern EQ where there's no real limit on the number of bands that you can have, it's much better to see the whole thing in one place. So but also, I like to mastering is this weird kind of balance of having empathy for what the artist or the client is trying to achieve, hearing and going, oh yeah, I can hear what you're going for. I can help you get closer to that. But also arrogance in the sense of, who am I to say, I know what you need to do that will make this even better. People have been working on this stuff for weeks or months or even years. So it is important to hear what is good in the material already. So that, like for example, the first thing I do when I'm mastering any song is just lift the level up to where I think it's going to work. I have a limiter at the end just to prevent any clipping, but it's just a straight level lift. And there's lots of reasons for that. One of them is this whole, the thing that drives the loudness war, which is when you turn things up, we think we hear more bass and treble, the smile curve or the equal loudness curve where it seems like it's bassier and treblier. So if you EQ stuff at a low level and then turn it up, chances are the EQ you made with the level down isn't going to be right. So first thing for me to do is bring the level up, then I can hear the EQ clearly and I can make those kind of adjustments, and then I can think about the dynamics processing. But if I bring the level up and it just sounds amazing, and I just don't hear that, it's not that often that it happens. There's always something you can do to just help something out or balance it with, But if there's nothing, well then great, job done. And in my mind, that song is just as mastered as the one that, I spent an hour and a half tuning the multiband compression and the parallel saturation and the mid-side, this, that, and the other. Because it's all about listening to it and thinking about all those things we're talking about, perspective and flow and balance and all that. So yeah, but I like to encourage minimalism in the processing. It's simpler, it's easier to kind of keep in your head and understand what's going on. But also, I think it's better sonically. I'm not convinced that pushing and pulling with multiple different processes, especially when you're talking about compression and limiting and clipping and stuff, is necessarily going to be in the benefit of the sound usually. But also it means that I don't do any more than I need to, because at the end of the day, if it's a great mix and a great song and a great arrangement, all that kind of stuff, my job basically is to get out of the way and let that work.
Mm-hmm. So then you kind of brought up an interesting point there, because you said that one of the first things that you do when you master is you have that level boost in there so that you're hearing everything. Now, when it comes to mixing or maybe preparing a mix for mastering, some people might hear that and think, well, should I make my mixes really loud and maybe start mixing with, a limiter on or something like that to get more volume? Like, what's your advice there to help people combat that volume difference and how it relates to the EQ?
The way that I like to use limiting, you will hardly hear it working. So I like to, the limiting that I like to use, generally my goal as a mastering engineer is to be invisible. I don't have like a signature sound that I'm stamping on something. A lot of mastering is about taste. And so a lot of what people come to me for is my opinion and my feedback. Mm-hmm. But, I'm going to, as I say, listen to what they're doing and try and make the most of that, not force my idea onto it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So everything that I'm doing is trying to be invisible. So it's, I don't want to, I want the compression to be invisible. I don't want somebody to listen to it and go, wow, listen to the mastering compression on that. I just want them to listen to it and go, what a great song. I love it. It makes me want to dance or headbang or, whatever that might be. So the same applies with limiting. And actually the way that I use compression and limiting is sharing the load between the two of them. I kind of use the limiter to do different things than the compression, so that neither of them has to work too hard and they're both doing what they're good at. So having said all of that, there is still quite often a big change when you come to mastering, especially if, we're talking about loudness. I don't believe in mastering super loud, but almost everything I do is made louder during the mastering process. So for me, it's about finding the sweet spot, right? It's this perfect balance between dynamics and loudness. And that can cause quite big changes in the way that the song feels because of the dynamic processing that's happened. And that can take people by surprise. I try and minimize that because what I'm trying to do is to be invisible. But there might be an advantage for somebody when they're mixing to take a listen to the mix with some limiting applied, just to hear the kind of thing that's happening. Because just for example, if you have a super spiky snare that's not been really controlled at all, and that hits a limiter hard, 3, 4, 5 dBs of gain reduction, say, that's going to pull the snare down, it's going to pull everything down. You're going to hear pumping, and you're going to hear a change in the transient attack of that snare. You might be fine with it, or you might hate it. but it's good to have an idea in advance. So I think playing around with a bit of limiting when you're mixing to kind of hear how it feels. And obviously also lots of people want to do a louder version just to supply to clients, if they're working with, or even if it's in your band to give to the other band members, just so that it's kind of in the right ballpark to the kind of stuff that they. So I have no problem with people doing that. What I would say is I would like, when I get to master that stuff, to have both versions. So I can hear, okay, this is the version you've been listening to. You're happy with that. Here's the mix. And then I can work from whichever one I like the best, If it's been tastefully, gently limited in the mix, I don't have a problem with that. I can use that as a master. Sometimes it's better to go back to the unprocessed version. So having said all of that, I don't think people should get overly concerned about the loudness in the mixing stage. It's okay. There's so many sides to this, because it's one of the hardest things as a mastering engineer is every so often the client will come along and they'll say to me really proudly, I use no compression at all in this. And because they think that I'm kind of all about dynamics, they think I'm going to think that's a good thing. Whereas actually I'm like, oh, okay, this is probably going to be really tough, because if you've got a mix with no compression in it, to get that up to the kind of level that people expect from a released master, I'm going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting in the mastering processing. And sometimes that can work really well, and sometimes it really doesn't. So on the other hand, the most common, you asked about kind of things that people struggle with and mistakes that I see. The thing that's really I'm seeing a lot at the moment, and most of us in the mastering profession is stuff that's coming in that's already as hot, if not way hotter than we would choose to master it. Mm-hmm. So because everybody's focused on loudness and all the rest of it, and they hear pro engineers talking about getting their mixes super loud so that the mastering doesn't change too much, they try and do that stuff as well. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And if it doesn't work, that's a real challenge in the mastering stage as well, because you've got all of these side effects of the processing that's been done baked into the sound, and you can't really get rid of it. So I think it's the same. The overall answer is a bit of balance. By all means, test with a limiter, experiment with some multiband compression, play around with it, get a feel. Is this, if you're hearing some big problem from putting a limiter on your mix, then maybe you want to address something in the mix to reduce that. On the other hand, it's not necessary, in my opinion, to get a mix to mastering level in the mix, right? I think there's a real value from having the processes separate.
Yeah.
Separate. And I know there are people who like to have mastering processing on the mix bus, and they do it per song. And I think there's a couple of risks I see with that. One is that you rely on the mastering processing, and that actually the mix is not as good as it could have been. Like doing the mix as a separate process and then applying the mastering processing separately, the mix has to be better before you get it to the mastering stage, and I think that's usually to the benefit. But the other thing is, typically you can only work on one song at a time, and for me it's all about context. Even if it's just how does this song work in relation to some reference material, or to other things that I know from the same genre. You can't. Well, I guess maybe you could have a session where you had an entire album's worth of stuff, an individual mix processing for every song and all the rest of it. But personally, I don't have the head space for it. It's when I'm mixing, I'm focused on all that stuff, like I don't know, the room mic compression on the drums, and the amount of reverb, and is that delay working right, and the chorus and all the rest of it. It's hard enough to kind of zoom out from that and say, okay, is this having the emotional impact that I want? Is the feel right? Is it is the mood coming across? Is it atmospheric enough? All that kind of thing. To then zoom out again and say, how does it relate to song 3 that I was working on 3 days ago? I just think that's kind of too much to ask. I think there's a big benefit to get the mixes to wherever you can, take a bit of time. If you're sending it to a mastering engineer, then you get that third-party feedback. But if not, by giving yourself a bit of time and space, you can then come to it with a fresh perspective, with a fresh mindset, and hopefully hear some new stuff and some useful stuff and make some valuable changes.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Yeah, especially because if you have a 10-song album that you're mixing and you're at like song 3, sure, you can listen back to song 1 and 2 and be like, okay, is this kind of in the right ballpark? But then you might get to song 6 and realize like, this song needs a totally different treatment. So yeah, you do kind of have to you have to serve the song, I think, at the end of the day, whether you're mixing or mastering, like it's all about what's going to be best for the song, and just focus on that. Don't get too caught up in everything else, and making that consistency, I think, in the mixing stage.
I think it's really liberating to, one of the big things, so lots of people take my course. Some of them may go on to be professional mastering engineers. Some of them end up asking me to do the mastering because they're like, yeah, I did the course, so now I know I don't want to be a mastering engineer. But a lot of them say that even though they don't necessarily intend to do a ton of mastering themselves, it was really, really valuable for them just to really understand the process and what you can and can't achieve at the mastering stage. It makes it easier for them in mixing, right? Because they can, when we're mixing, all these different things kind of come up that occur to us about how the song, we're all constantly, it's never as good as it is in our head as we imagine, right? But knowing that you can deal with the balance between the two songs and the overall amount of bass and treble, and maybe you can get a bit more density out of that song or tweak the stereo width on that one, whatever it is, understanding what's possible just takes a load of things off the table that you don't necessarily have to worry about in the same way at the mixing stage.
Yeah.
So I think in some ways it kind of makes that easier.
100%. Yeah, I think it goes back to kind of what you were talking about earlier, how, if you do a mix and then you throw on a limiter or the multiband or whatever, and you can start to hear what that does, it's good to know what's going to be added later on in the process, but also realize that, one of the big reasons why you're going to be hiring a mastering engineer is often for that objectivity. So, it's good to know that that person may use these tools, but they're coming into it from a completely fresh perspective. And so, they haven't heard the song a million times before. And so they're just going to be approaching it slightly different than however you're going to throw it into your own sessions. I even understanding the tools too, and how they affect the sound. I think that's a really big thing. I remember back in the day, experimenting with putting a Waves L2 on my master and being like, oh, what happened to all the snares, just how they affect all the transients and stuff like that. So it's good to know the tools and to know maybe what the person's going to be using, how they might use it. But if you're going to be hiring a mastering engineer, leave it up to them, I think, in the end. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. But also, even if you're going to be mastering it yourself, I think giving yourself that time and that space, because you're absolutely right. You could experiment with these tools and you could come up with something that you really like for, song 1. But then, as you say, you get to song 6 and you suddenly realize, oh, actually, I want to push this even harder. And if I'm doing that, then song 1's not going to sound quite right. So, I mean, you can go back and you can tweak it, right? But then for me, it's just much there's a real value in doing it as a separate process, just kind of coming in afresh one day and go, okay, today I'm going to master this album, and just work through the songs. Because that's one of the interesting things. I mean, you're saying about third-party perspective, and that's absolutely correct. One of the challenges as a mastering engineer is somebody brings you something they've been working on for weeks or months. And in a very short space of time, or relatively short space of time, most sessions probably about a day, you're giving your perspective and your feedback and making suggestions basically for how it could sound even better. But actually, there is value to doing that quickly and efficiently because it's closer to how somebody hears the album for the first time, right? Because most people will just put the album on and they'll play it through, and it's all about first impressions. And I think so. Yeah, there's lots of things about having mastering as a separate process that I think are helpful for people.
Yeah, I agree with that. Definitely the perspective thing is a really big one. And I was curious to ask, because obviously you work with a lot of people who are mastering their own material. So as far as keeping that objectivity, that perspective, what do you recommend for people? Is it just making the mastering a separate process, or are there any other tips you can suggest there to help them with that?
I definitely think taking some time is helpful because the risk especially if you're mastering your own stuff, is that we're so caught up in the story of why it sounds the way that it sounds, that we can almost make excuses. Like somebody might bring something to me and I'll say, oh, there's a bit of boom in the kick drum there. I'm just going to notch that out. And they're like, oh yeah, that was because of the blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, that's interesting, but it's still too boomy, right? Whereas the temptation, if we're kind of go, oh yeah, there's the boom, well, and you just leave it, So I think the more you have time away from the mix just to kind of disconnect from all of that stuff and come to it with an open mind is valuable. I would recommend people listen to it somewhere else, because another big thing that happens is, we're music fans, we're audio enthusiasts, so we set up a room to work in. We go in there, we work on our music day in, day out, then we take it out to somewhere else and it just sounds weird and wrong. And there's two things happening there. One is we haven't listened to enough music in our own space. We listen to our own stuff, but not everything else. So I'd recommend everybody out there who's interested in doing this stuff, just play other music all the time in the background when you're doing, you're doing emails or reading blogs or whatever it is. And over time, your brain will learn how everything else sounds in your room, and that will help you get it in the right ballpark. I mean, that's helpful for mixing and for mastering, but particularly for mastering. But the other thing is to take it out and try it on another system that you know well. I mean, we have to be careful with this. I've got it's not my saying, but I heard it somewhere and I really love it, which is a man with a watch can tell you what the time is, but a man with two is never sure. And it's same thing applied. If you listen to it on one set of speakers, you know what it sounds like. Listen to it on two, it's like, well, which set is right? If you listen to it on five, you're kind of at sea. So I suggest to people, like lots of people who do my course, I suggest get a really good good quality pair of headphones, like Sennheiser HD650s or Audezys, if you can stretch them, whatever they are. Super accurate, takes the room out of the equation. So any issues that there might be with the monitoring in terms of the room acoustics or your speakers, it'll at least be different on headphones, and hopefully more accurate, especially if you can use something like SonarWorks to correct the EQ balance, which I do recommend, even for the headphones like Audeze. It takes the room out of the equation, it gives you a fresh perspective, right? So a good high quality pair of headphones, and just listen and see what you think and make notes. Just kind of, is the vocal a little bit harsh? Is it, was the bass a little bit boomy here? Whatever you might hear. Then go back into the mastering room and listen again. And quite often, once you've noticed those things, you'll go, oh yeah, I can hear it here as well. Now my attention's been drawn to it. And in that case, you want to correct it. If you don't hear it at all, then maybe try it in a few other places. And if you don't hear it anywhere else, well, it was probably the smart speaker or the earbuds or whatever it was that you used when you were taking notes. But if you hear it in a bunch of different places, then probably that's something you might want to adjust. So having at least two, but maybe, or at least one alternative, really trusted way of listening to music, somewhere that you listen a lot. So it could be earbuds, it could be a smart speaker, it could be in the car, wherever it is, somewhere where you have instincts, you just put stuff on, you go, that doesn't feel quite right. That's really useful feedback. So that can, it's the same thing as, that thing where you've got a mix and you're loving it. And then you call somebody and say, listen to this. And suddenly you notice 5 things that are wrong with it. It's that change of perspective, just listening in a slightly different way. And all this kind of stuff comes up, and that's really valuable. You've got the opportunity then to address that.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great advice. Like, I do agree with you that people just don't often take enough time to learn their speakers or listen to music on their speakers. They're just working on them all the time. And when you do that, it's like, it's great. You're working on stuff. But if you don't have that perspective of like what actually sounds good, what should your speakers sound like, that's a really important part of it. And obviously when it comes to creating mixes that will translate or masters that translate, you need to know your speakers really well.
You said the magic word there, which is translate. And that's something that I was going to mention. You're absolutely right. The goal of mastering is to make things translate, but lots of people don't quite get what we mean when we say translate. I completely understand it, right? You think, I want my stuff to sound amazing everywhere, right? But that's impossible. Nothing is ever going to sound amazing on a pair of these Apple earbuds. They're not good enough. But it can sound amazing in comparison with everything else. It can sound as good as it's possible to sound on those earbuds, or on those Beats headphones, or in that car, or wherever. So translation is making stuff sound as people expect on every system, right? Not amazing. You're never going to get genuine bass out of a phone speaker, but you can get the right level of bass in comparison to all the other stuff that people are listening to in that genre out of a phone speaker, and therefore it's translated to that speaker. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I always tell my coaching students, like, sometimes the goal isn't to make things sound great on your speakers, as weird as that sounds. Like, sometimes you just need to understand what your speakers are supposed to sound like. And if they're limited in the low end, you shouldn't be boosting that low end so that you hear it. Like, that's going to blow up on another speaker. So you really do have to understand what your speakers sound like in order to find that balance. And like you said, get something that sounds like everything else, because then it's going to work. If it can stack up against other tracks, then that's ultimately what you're looking for. So yeah, I think taking the time to really like analyze what music sounds like on all the various systems you have, that's a really big part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You talked a little bit earlier about like dynamics, and I know that is something that we've talked about, dynamics and loudness, but I know that's something that you are very passionate about, and so much so you run an event every year called Dynamic Range Day. And so I know that your take on it is that people shouldn't be mastering so loud, and instead they should be focused on making mixes that sound dynamic. And I'm sure that there's maybe you want to define that a little bit more, but like there's a balance that I think you find between all that, right?
I think it's less that I think people shouldn't be mastering super loud. I think it's more that people should feel comfortable not mastering super loud. Fair. If they don't want to, right? I think the problem with the situation that we've got into is that because, I mean, there was literally my good friend Ian Stewart, who actually, who writes for Isotope and who did my home mastering masterclass course a long time ago, has just done a post for Isotope analyzing Billboard top 50 maybe hits.
I saw that. It's a great article.
Of recent hits, and just kind of saying, here's what we see. Here's what people are doing with True Peaks. Here's what people are doing with loudness, all the rest of it. And sure enough, the majority of, well, I say the majority, lots of them are very loud, and I think the loudest was -6 LUFS integrated. We could get into LUFS and the integrated stuff maybe if people are interested, but that's pretty loud. But he also points out that there's stuff out there that has been super successful that was at -11 LUFS, which is the kind of loudness that I'm much more comfortable with personally. In terms of the sweet spot for me, when you start pushing much beyond -11 up to -10 and higher, that's when there are benefits to getting stuff into that sweet spot. But when you start trying to push it over the top, I think that's when you can run into problems. So my concern, the headline of that Isotope picked for the post was something like, what you should be doing in 2024, right? And that's the bit that I'm not so sure about. It's like, yes, that's what's being done with lots of hit records. But my question is, maybe, did they need that to be hit records? I think they would still have been hit records even if they hadn't been pushed that loud, right? I think almost everything else that goes into making a record is more important than just what the LUFS measurement is, because one huge reason is that most people are listening to streaming services, YouTube, Apple Music, Tidal, Spotify, and by default, all of those will turn the super loud stuff down, right? So those hits that are in the Billboard top 50 or whatever it was, the ones at -6 and the ones at -11, they're all going to get played at -14. So whatever advantage there was to being at -6 originally goes away when people listen to it. I mean, some people turn normalization off, and lots of musicians and engineers turn off normalization. In fact, I asked in one of the Facebook groups I'm in, and 75% of people said they turned it off. But Spotify have said that only 17% of their users turn it off. Right? So if you round those numbers up, 80% of us, the people who really care most about the music, are listening to it in a way that 80% of music fans don't, which to me is crazy. So kind of rewinding slightly, it means there's no need to be at -6. Because even on a CD where people will actually hear that super loud result, they're going to turn it down because it's, it'll be louder than the thing they were listening to previously. Or if it's a bit quiet, they'll turn it up. So for the first 10 or 20 seconds, the loudness has an influence, and then it doesn't anymore. And then people come back at me and say, no, it needed to be that loud to get the sound, which that's possible, right? And in some genres, like, I don't know, maybe EDM, super limited drums and all that kind of stuff, maybe there's some weight to that argument. But I mean, I just recently did a YouTube video where I did some comparisons between masters with way different loudnesses. And when you listen to them in the way that they're heard on Spotify and YouTube and Apple Music and all the rest of it, actually, they all have the right sound. They all sound great. They were all huge hits, even though the loudness has been taken away. And stuff that's mastered at -14 can work just as well. I'm not saying you should master at -14 or any other loudness. This is a long answer. The short version is people should feel free to do what they think is best for the music. Yeah. And you need to be aware that currently -14 is the kind of ballpark that the streaming services are looking at. So if you master something quieter than -14, it's liable to sound quieter in comparison to everything else. And if that's a problem for you, then you should probably be looking at -14 as a minimum. But -14 is, even for me, it's pretty quiet. Like I say, most of the loud stuff that I master is more like -11, -10. And 3 dB louder makes a big difference. Mm-hmm. And there's a ton of stuff out there that's way louder than that. So once you get to -14, you can do what you think is creatively the best for the music. And I think that's, I hate the idea that people are crushing, I don't know, well, country, for example. Country is a genre where especially in the US, it's maxed out. And I'm just thinking, does that fit the music? Does that make sense, really? And, you see it across the board now. I mean, even classical, some of the stuff is being pushed super loud. And if people are doing it for creative reasons and because they love the way that sounds, of course, that's fine, right? I'm never going to tell anybody they shouldn't do that. But lots of people tell me, oh, well, I really love that master, but I feel like I've got to go a couple of dBs louder because to compete, and I'm just like, compete with what? With nobody's going to hear it. and nobody cares. Sound on Sound magazine did some research years ago where they didn't even match the loudness. They just gave people different songs at different levels. And they found that it didn't make any difference to whether people liked the songs or not. And you look at, there's people who've done research into it. You can compare, you can look at chart success versus loudness and all the rest of it. And okay, these days, most things are mastered really loud, but over history, it just doesn't, some of the biggest hits in history were not mastered super loud. So yeah, you're right. I get passionate about this stuff because I see people, it's treading on their creativity, and on their musical instincts. And they end up doing stuff because they think they need to, or because they think they ought to, or because so-and-so did it. And they didn't need to, and it would have sounded just as good if they hadn't. So that seems like a shame to me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I feel like has come up many times with all the mastering engineers that I've interviewed on this podcast is that a lot of people have come to this consensus of like making one master to rule them all. And I get that argument, but also, and you kind of touch on this too, like there is the option to disable normalization, and things might be getting played in a club or whatever. And so with that in mind, if you are mastering at lower levels and all this other stuff, like people could argue that your songs won't compete in the same loudness, or if something were played in a club against another track that was much louder, like your track would sound quieter and maybe a little weaker. So when it comes to that one master to rule them all theory, what's your take on that, and factoring in or considering the fact that people may have this normalization turned off?
So I personally, I think I came up with one master to rule them all, but maybe not. I remember saying it and not having heard it from somebody else, but I probably picked it up from somebody else. But anyway, I like that concept. So the masters that I do are suitable for CD. They're suitable for streaming. In fact, they're really good for streaming. The CDs will not be as loud as some of the loudest stuff out there, but they're still good and loud. And actually, when I'm sending stuff to be pressed for vinyl, I disable, unless it's making a big contribution to the final sound, I disable the final limiter because, well, Scott Hull from Masterdisc, for one, who I interviewed on the last episode of my podcast, says that actually enables him to cut literally louder vinyl, get better use of the space of the grooves on the record, because they can, all the wiggly stuff can interlock basically in a really complicated way, and he can just pack more in. So with that one exception of going for vinyl, where even less limiting, I like the one master to rule them all concept. The clubs are a complicated one. And I did an episode of my podcast talking specifically about club music. So anybody who's listening to this who's interested might want to check that out, where I talked to, someone who's a mastering engineer and a DJ, and kind of understands it from both perspectives. And I do get there are some particular issues there. DJs, there is no loudness normalization on the hardware, the CDJ players that get used in the clubs. So it has to be done by hand. So it's a real struggle for them if something is obviously 10 dB lower than something else. I got two pushbacks against that, I guess. One is when we look at a genre like EDM, there is some stuff up there at -4, but there's also a ton of stuff at -8. So that's a 4 dB difference, right? I'm recommending -11, maybe -10 for a super loud. So that's another couple of dBs down on the loudest stuff, but only 2 dBs down on the stuff that's kind of in the middle. I don't think that's beyond the capability of a DJ to balance personally. I don't think that's excessive. Yes, if you want to master it at kind of 1980s vinyl levels of -16 or -18 or whatever, I can see how that would be a real challenge. But to me, a few dBs doesn't seem like a deal breaker, especially when they're already building, they're already balancing the -8 stuff with the -4 stuff, right? But the other thing is, okay, maybe in that situation, you break the rule for clubs and you have a club master that is even more slammed to keep the DJs happy. But then the version that goes on streaming has a bit more in the way of dynamics. And that's something that, for example, Luca Pretelesi, who was interviewed on my podcast, we talked about this. That's something that he does. He does the club version is even more pushed just to make sure that the DJs don't have any issues when they're trying to build it into a super loud set. But you've got to, now his stuff is still super loud. His more dynamic versions are -8, right? As opposed to, I guess, -6. But maybe that's an argument for not doing one master to rule them all. It's like one master to rule them all, except for vinyl and clubs. The situation where people have loudness normalization disabled is tricky because, to me, I've heard this argument. People say, well, given that whatever it is, 17% of people might have disabled loudness normalization, why not make it good and loud for them if it doesn't make it any worse for anybody else. And I guess there's a certain logic to that. It's just that for me, there's always a price to be paid. It's hard because we don't often get that opportunity to listen to the before and after to say, I kind of say, I wish this was a little bit more dynamic, and people pop up and say, you don't know, you haven't heard that original. And anyway, that's exactly the way the artist intended them. And of course, they're absolutely right. But in the situations where I have had the chance to hear more dynamic versions, so like with Death Magnetic, where there was the version that got released for a computer game, and that's the first time people really, on a large scale, kind of heard that comparison. But also now with Atmos Masters, the binaural versions are much more dynamic, and you can do a comparison there. Every time I get to do the comparison, to me, the slightly more dynamic version always benefits from that little bit of extra snap and clarity and depth and all the rest of it. So that's a kind of, I feel like in the same way that I don't master for earbuds, right? These are limited in terms of what the sound quality they're capable of reproducing. So are NS10s, so are smart speakers. I don't make any kind of allowances for that when I'm mastering, because that would ruin it for everybody who's got better quality monitoring available to them. I'm looking for something, like we said, that will translate, that will work on the widest possible range. So for me as well, with the whole loudness normalization issue, it's, well, if 83% of people are listening with it on, that's the most important use case to me. And if people who listen without get something that's a few dBs quieter, providing the client is happy, if the client's not happy, then I'm upfront about all of this stuff. When people come and talk to me, one of the first conversations we have is about loudness. And if they say, look, we want this super loud, then I'll say, honestly, I'm probably not the best person to do this. I'm just not going to enjoy it, and you don't want me working on it if I'm not enjoying myself. The whole, this wants to be a win-win. So you should look for somebody else who's going to have more fun doing that, but most of my clients actually genuinely don't care about that stuff. They're like, no, we completely agree with you. Make it sound as good as it can possibly sound. And if it's not quite as loud as everything else, well, then fine. That tends to be my approach. I think the last thing that I would say on that is we're talking about this 83-17, so 17% of Spotify users. So normalization is enabled by default on Spotify. So if you do a fresh install, it's there. All the loud stuff will get turned down. 17% of users apparently go in and change that, whether it's disable it or choose a different setting, whatever it might be. So that's a small proportion. But the number one place that people listen to music online is still YouTube. YouTube has 80% of the users, right? So that 17% of Spotify users is 17% of way less than 20%. You add up, so it's literally 4 out of 5 people are hearing music on YouTube, and all the other streaming services fit into that remaining 1 out of 5 people, right? And most of them have normalization enabled. So it's just such a small number of people, I think. That's the way that I see it. It's, of course, everybody's going to have to make up their own minds. And I completely appreciate, in particular, the pressure on mastering engineering. I'm lucky. I've been talking about this stuff for 10 years. So the people who come to me usually know that I don't want to do super loud and don't ask me to. That's not the case for a lot of my colleagues. They're working for major labels. They're talking to A&R reps. Everybody wants it super loud. It's a very difficult situation to navigate. So I have a lot of sympathy for those engineers. But yeah, my perspective is, especially for future proofing, I don't think this current situation is going to last forever. I think normalization is not perfect. In fact, it's really annoying in lots of ways at the moment. There's all kinds of quirks and weird, you listen to it in a web browser, it won't be normalized. So it can be really frustrating, and I get that. But it's improving all the time. The services of the levels used to be all over the place, and they're more or less standardized at -14. They used to use different methods of measuring it. Now they all use LUFS. LUFS isn't perfect, but if you use a thing called album mode instead of track mode, so that you keep the relationships between songs as they were on the original album, that makes it work even better. There's probably other improvements that can happen over time. And I just think, like, I don't compensate. I don't do masters especially for MP3. MP3 and streaming codecs mess up the sound somewhat, but there's no point in trying to compensate for it, because they might change it next week. They'll switch to a different codec, or they'll change the bandwidth that's available on mobile devices or whatever it is. So again, I don't master for earbuds or MP3s or for loudness for its own sake. If it's creatively needed, that's a different issue. But because I think all of those things are temporary, they're going to go away. And when people are looking back on the music of now from 10 years, just like we look back on the stuff back in the 80s and early 90s. It's going to sound great. And that's what I want.
Fair. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you're taking, I was going to say 80-20 principle to this, but I guess it's more 83-17. But yeah, it's like really focusing on what are the majority of people doing, because you're gonna sacrifice something one way or another. So might as well feed the majority. Give them what they really need.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's really hard because people tell me if you send your music to a music library or to somebody who has the opportunity of putting it in a DJ set or, signing you to their label, they're skipping through and it sounds quiet. I am told that people just skip it. And I think if it's a really big difference, then that is probably true. So it's a big concern for people. And it's just such a shame that it's become such an issue. I mean, I understand why people worry about this stuff. But I mean, here's another thing. I've been doing this, I've been kind of following these ideas for whatever it is. Well, my entire career, basically, because at some point in the late 90s, it got to a point where I thought, I'm not going to go any louder. There were new releases coming out louder. And I just thought, I'm not interested in chasing that. I'm comfortable with where I'm mastering, and I haven't changed it since. There's like a handful of people who've said, it's really not loud enough. And, they either ask me to change it or they go somewhere else or whatever it is. But it's a small number of clients for me. So, yeah, it's difficult, but and every time I keep wishing I could just leave it alone as a topic. It's like, I'm done with that. Can I stop talking about that now? And then something will come out, and I'll just listen to it and go, I love this song, and it just doesn't sound quite as good as I hoped it would. And then I'm just when I think I'm out, they suck me back in.
Yeah. Well, so then speaking of like you wishing that songs would sound better, dynamic range, obviously that's like a major thing you focus on there. So this may be a loaded question, but like when it comes to dynamic range, how do you define what sounds good? Like what should people be listening for to know that they've kind of hit that sweet spot, if there's a way to define that?
That's really interesting. I mean, one thing that I would say just briefly is that we have to be careful with the term dynamic range. And I know that sounds rich coming from somebody who invented dynamic range day, but that's back. It seemed like a good idea at the time. And with hindsight, I wish I'd chosen something else, because strictly speaking, dynamic range technically is the difference is the difference between the loudest and the quietest thing on the record, right? And actually, even the Loudness Wars don't have a huge impact on that. There's still plenty of contrast between the loud and quiet sections on albums. It's just that the loud sections are super, super crushed, So you've got a song with lots of contrast, the whole thing gets turned up, so the loud bit gets squashed. And that's the bit that I wish wasn't happening. In terms of what the perfect balance is, so it's something that I have just, that is, when it's right, it feels right. I know that's completely unhelpful. I can give people numbers as guidelines so they can test. I mean, one thing they could do is if they head over to my website, productionadvice.co.uk, hit the about button. There's a playlist on there on Spotify of stuff that I've worked on over the years. It's a bit out of date at this point, but it's got a bunch of stuff in a load of different genres, and all of that I think sounds pretty good. Not necessarily the best ever or perfect, but I'm comfortable with that representing my work. And I think all of those have well-balanced dynamics. I can give you an example of what is not well-balanced dynamics is when, the chorus hits or the drop arrives and it just doesn't hit. It just doesn't have any impact. It just kind of sits there, or even maybe gets a little bit quieter. That for me is a dynamics fail. On the flip side, if you've got a song where you're, listening, singing along in the chorus, and then the verse just disappears and you can't hear it, or it just loses energy, that's where you've got too much in the way of dynamics for me. It would have been better balanced if there was a different contrast between the verse and the chorus, so that it maintains the energy through the verse while still stepping back a bit. And I mean, one of the interesting things, people are quite often surprised by how loud I master quiet songs, which might sound weird, but it's, the overall level is only one of the things. There's so much that we pay attention to when we're listening to music, So we know that a soft female vocal is a soft sound, even if it's turned up really loud, right? And there is this, you want things to translate. So that means to some extent, you've got to be careful about people listening not in super quiet rooms on the best monitoring ever, right? People listen out in the world on earbuds. So you don't want the quiet songs in an album just disappearing into the background noise. You want them to stay at a similar level. So, one of the, I won't say it's a trick, but something that, like I say, people are sometimes surprised by is I might make a quiet song fairly loud, quiet enough that it feels quiet in comparison to the loud thing or the louder things that come before and after it, right? But just balanced enough, just in that sweet spot. In terms of numbers, if people want to play around with this, one thing I would say is ignore the integrated loudness, right? So most people know about LUFS, loudness units full scale. It's like RMS, but it's better. And all the streaming services use the integrated value, which is the overall value for a song. So they take the quiet sections, they take the loud sections, they come up with a final number that takes all of that into consideration. Problem with that is if you take a very loud song and a song that's intended to be quiet, like an acoustic balance, and you match the overall loudness of those two, the acoustic song is going to sound too loud in comparison to the loud thing, right? Because metal is meant to sound loud and acoustic folk is meant to sound quiet. What I found works much better is if you find the loudest bits of each song and match those. So when people are mastering, I mean, another good tip is to listen for the vocal levels. You keep consistent vocal levels through an album or through a collection of songs. Almost anything can happen around them and they'll seem to work because as humans, we pay so much attention to the vocal. It's such an important element of the song, or the lead instrument if there isn't a vocal, for example. But yeah, if you balance the loudness of those loudest sections and then listen to the rest of the song, and so, you've got your monitoring set up, so the loud bit of your loudest song sounds huge and you love it, and you're rocking out to it. And then you have another song that's got more variety in it, and you get the loudest section of that so that it feels right in comparison to the one you just did. But then you skip back to the beginning and you get to the quiet intro, and suddenly it sounds a bit too quiet. That, to me, is an opportunity to use a little bit of gentle automation to lift that intro up so that it feels right. You haven't changed the overall level of the song. The loud section is still the same loudness, but you've reduced the dynamic contrast slightly between those two so that the intro sits really nicely. That, for me, that's how I work. That's a really effective way of balancing the loudness and dynamics. So you listen to the loudest sections and then everything else is a musical decision. Quite often, between a verse and a chorus, you've got 3, 4, 5 dB difference, maybe, in that ballpark. But always go by the music. Always go by the way that it. With all of this stuff, go with the way that it sounds. Mm-hmm. And for me personally, I think if those loudest sections are at -10 short term, right? So another confusing thing about LUFS, about LUFS, is there's momentary, short term, and integrated. Integrated is the whole song. Momentary is super fast, but the short term is more similar to what a VU meter used to show you that I was trained on when I was coming up as a mastering engineer. And if you look at those short-term LUFS, around about -10 for the loud sections, I think that's a really good place to be. So if anybody wants to experiment with this, that's what I would suggest. And there's more on that idea. If you go to productionadvice.co.uk/how-loud, kind of talk about that in more detail, and there's other links and stuff where people can hear examples and stuff.
Love it. Yeah. Yeah, I do think that there's people learn these numbers and they think this is the target. I have to always hit this loudness or this spec. And I do think it's very confusing that we have the AES saying here's specs for what we recommend, and then Spotify's well, here's our thing, and titles this way. And so it does make it very hard to figure out what is the right move with all of this stuff. And when it comes to dynamic range, one thing that I was curious to get your take on is I know you do have a plugin, Dynameter, which gives people specs on how dynamic their tracks are. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that plugin and how it might be helpful for people, and what they should know about reading the numbers on that and how that relates to what we're talking about here.
Absolutely. So just quickly to talk about because I was involved with those AES specifications that you're talking about. And actually, I was involved in the original one, and then I came in towards the end of the newest recommendations and dropped a huge grenade in the proceedings because I said, can we take out the word target, right? Because it had 53 uses of the word target in that specification, that recommendation, which, by the way, the recommendation is for the streaming services, not for us, not for music producers, right? So they're saying, the AES are saying to Spotify and YouTube, here's what we suggest to get really effective loudness normalization that gets the best quality for everybody and is effective. And you're right. The streaming services are not yet paying attention, but hopefully they will. They're following some of the suggestions, but not all of them. But yeah, we changed target loudness from that term, which is misleading, right? I mean, obviously, that's why I said they should change it, because somebody reads that and they think, okay, that's what a target is something you aim for, right? And that's not what it is. They changed it to distribution loudness, which is much more accurate, right? That's how loud it will get played, regardless of what you do with it. So if you master it at -6, it's going to get played at the distribution loudness, which most places is -14. That doesn't mean you should aim for -14 or any other number, partly because, like I said, if you aim for an integrated loudness, if you aim for -14 with a rock song and -14 with an acoustic folk song, they wouldn't sound right musically in relation to each other, because one of them's meant to be louder than the other. So that's one reason not to aim for a target. But also, the overall loudness value can be misleading. If you've got a song that's loud all the way through, you'll get a high number. If you've got more variety, you'll get a lower number. You match them and you end up with the loud sections of the one with more variety actually ending up louder than the one that's loud all the way through. So people just need to forget about targets, right? It's useful to know that, and as I say, if you're below -14, you will be quieter than everything else, right? So just know and understand that. But once you get to -14, there is no target. There's nothing. It's what's musically right. And so my recommendations there for -10 are the same thing that's baked into Dynameter. So Dynameter measures the crest factor, which is the difference between the peaks and the short-term loudness of the music. So, peaks are usually up near 0. I recommend -1 just to have a little bit of room to play with the streaming codecs, because it always decodes with some extra peaks in there and you don't want to get them clipped. But whatever the peak value is, if you think about my suggestion, if you've got the peaks at -1 and you've got the short-term loudness at -10, that's 9 dBs difference between the peaks and the short-term loudness. And that's we call it the PSR, the peak to short-term loudness ratio. But it's the crest factor. It's the difference between the peaks and the loudness. So you don't need Dynameter. You can just watch your loudness meter and go, oh, -10, peaks at -1, don't want to go much louder than that. The nice thing about Dynameter is it shows you this graph of this PSR value. So what you see is when the loudness gets high, the graph starts to get narrow. We start to color it. It goes from kind of blue and purple into green, and then orange, and then red, and then brown, at the point where I think there's too much limiting or clipping, or there's not enough crest factor for things to, in my experience, sound good. And then after that, it goes grey. So some of the songs on Death Magnetic are grey almost all the way through, and they just look like a little bit of string down the middle of the meter. Whereas I like things to, genuinely, it's optimized so the stuff that I master looks colourful and nice, because I want my results to look good. And so that's how it's helpful. If people like the idea of aiming for the sweet spot that I suggest, and, kind of agree that since everything is normalized, let's not go for super loud, let's go for balance, let's go for hitting the sweet spot on Dynameter. If you get the loud sections just touching the red, then that's putting you in great shape. And then you can balance the rest by ear, and hopefully, and over time, you just get an instinct. It's not like I sit there mastering, watching this meter. I don't suggest anybody does that, but it's there in the corner of my screen, and every so often I just notice it. That's been red for a long time. Maybe have I gone louder than I meant to? What can I tweak something here to adjust it? And sometimes the answer is no. In which case I'm like, okay, so it's red, so that's good. Just like any other meter, it's a visual aid, it's a guide, it's a kind of early warning system, if you like, rather than something you need to follow slavishly. But quite often, if it's been in the red for a long time and it's not meant to be super intense, then I'll find that just by moving some things around a little bit, I can get something that sounds just as loud, sounds just as good, and even better. And that's the goal, right? Is to not accidentally push things too far.
Of course. Well, one last question that I have for you in regards to that is that, like you said, like you don't want to be staring at this meter the entire time you're working, because that could totally mess up everything as well. But there's the opposite thing where some people will, they'll throw on the meter at the end, or they'll look at it near the end once they feel like they've got a good balance, and then they'll see, oh, maybe I'm in the brown or the gray or whatever. How do you then, what's your recommendations then to like reverse engineer that to get the numbers to a more manageable place? Because it's not just a matter of turning it down necessarily. It's compression and all that other stuff probably comes into play, right?
So it depends on the exact signal chain. But for me, the limiter and a clipper, if I'm using one, because sometimes I use a little bit of gentle soft clipping prior to the limiter, those two things are right at the end of the chain. I'm talking in the mastering chain. So for me, it's just a question of easing back I take back the level at the beginning of the mastering chain. So it just eases back on all the dynamics processing prior to that. And so if you imagine, the peaks are up there at the top, and you say you've got it set to -1, and your loudness is here, and it's pushing up and it's getting too close. You just ease the loudness back there. The limiter stays where it is. The limiter ceiling is still there. It's just more space for the music to breathe. And quite so depending on how it's set up, it could just be a matter of backing off the input to the limiter by a couple of dBs, or the beginning of the chain by a couple, or the output of the compression stage, wherever it is. It's just easing back somewhere. It's no good doing it after the limiting of the compression, because then you're just turning it down. It's still as squashed as it was, right? You've got to do it somewhere earlier in the chain, and the perfect place to adjust that depends on the material. Just like, because for some songs I might have lots of compression and very light limiting. For others, I might choose to have more aggressive limiting and less compression, or no compression and pure limiting, or clipping and no limiting. There's all these different variables, and it's just a question of kind of looking at it and thinking, well, where is, what is it that's causing that constriction, that bottleneck, that's pushing that peak to loudness so low, and how can I ease back on that and give it a little bit more room to breathe?
That makes sense. Yeah, that's great advice. Man, I could probably chat your ear off about so much of this stuff, because there's just so much depth we can go into with all of this. But this has been awesome. It's been great to learn more about your approach to all of this. And I think you've done a great job of clarifying a lot of the confusion in the industry, and understanding what these various terms are. And I think that's really helpful for people listening to this. So thank you for that. If people want to learn more about you, follow your educational stuff online, or maybe even work with you, that kind of stuff, what's the best way for them to do that?
Probably head over to productionadvice.co.uk. That's got links there, or you can go to the podcast, which is themasteringshow.com. But yeah, that'll have my YouTube videos are there, so you can find the YouTube channel. Well, honestly, the best thing to do is sign up for the email list. So if you look over on the right-hand side of the site, I forget what it says, but there's a box that says sign up here. If they just drop an email into there, then they'll get updates from me whenever I do new stuff. I give them heads up on any special offers that I might be running or whatever. But you can also, if you just search for me, I'm there on Facebook. I don't do much on X anymore, sadly, the place that it has become. But I'm starting to do stuff on Instagram. Don't really get Instagram, but I'm there as well. So, people can find me in all the usual places. And I'd love it if people want to drop me a message and say hi.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for doing this. Really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
So that was my interview with Ian Shepherd, and I loved learning more about his process and his philosophies. And I loved his take on balancing volume versus dynamics. I think that's a really important thing. Ian did a really great job of explaining some of the objections that people might have when it comes to, should you be mastering louder versus quieter? Should we be compressing our masters more aggressively? That kind of stuff. I think he made a lot of really compelling arguments for why it maybe makes more sense to master a little bit quieter to benefit the songs. And I think at the end of the day, if you ask any artist, what do you want? Do you want the best version of your song? They're all going to say yes. But we also do need to acknowledge the fact that, people still are kind of set in some old school ways of thinking, where they think that their tracks need to be just as loud as other commercial songs. But I think that as long as we as mastering engineers are informed in terms of what's going to happen with these songs once they're released, where are they going, then we can have these kind of conversations with our clients to discuss, okay, well, there's going to be normalization. So everything's going to be at the same level no matter what. I think those are really important conversations to have with our clients, so that us as mastering engineers, we can balance technical specs with our own personal tastes and the needs of our client to figure out what is the best marriage of all of those things. And ultimately, at the end of the day, make something that our clients are happy with. So, that is the biggest thing that we need to factor in here, is at the end of the day, we are providing a service to people, and we want to make sure that our clients are happy. And we can sometimes inform them to things that they don't know about. That's an important part of the process, in my opinion. And I think a lot more mastering engineers should be doing that, as opposed to just doing what they think most clients want, or the opposite, doing what the mastering engineer thinks is the best thing. Having conversations, I think, is really important. So Ian definitely covered that in today's episode. He had a lot of really good points to make on both sides of the conversation. I also really enjoyed talking a lot about the idea of translation and understanding your speakers and what that really means to make masters or mixes that translate well. And I think that Ian brought up a ton of great points there as far as how to learn your speakers and what kind of things you can be doing to help ensure that your masters translate. I agree. I think a lot of people don't spend enough time listening to music on their speakers. They tend to have studio monitors that they just work on, but you do need to learn your speakers really well. You need to understand the calibration of your monitors and how that relates to masters that actually do translate outside of your studio or mixes that translate outside of your studio. I think a lot of the advice that Ian shared here is really solid, and I would definitely make sure to implement a lot of this stuff to make sure that you're actually evaluating your music properly as you work on your tracks. Definitely go back to that section of this episode and take notes and implement that and study your speakers, because once you know that, the better you know your speakers, the better you know your room, the easier the process of mixing and mastering is going to be. So yeah, I really enjoyed that part of our conversation as well. But yeah, in the end, I think this episode was awesome. Ian shared so much good stuff. And if you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe to it. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. Now, speaking of translation, if you are currently working on tracks of your own and you're struggling to get your mixes to translate and sound good from one set of speakers to another, or maybe you're just working on your tracks and you're struggling to get the sounds that you hear in your head to come out of your speakers, you're not getting the clarity or the impact or the energy that you ultimately want for your music. If you're not sure of what to do to fix those situations and to make your song sound better, that is exactly how I help out my students inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. And inside of that program, I work one-on-one with my students to help make sure that they are clear on the process from beginning to end, from recording, editing, and mixing their music, and that they're implementing everything properly and getting the results that they want. So if you want clarity on what steps you should be taking along the way, if you want feedback as you work on your tracks to know that you are on the right path, or to get advice on what things you need to tweak in your mixes to get better results. Once again, that is exactly what I focus on inside of Amplitude. So if you're interested in learning more about this program, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/Amplitude, and you can find all the details on that page there. On that page, scroll through it, and you should find a link where you can book a call with me. I'd love to hop on a call to learn more about you and your goals and your current processes, to see what's working for you, what's not working for you, what you're struggling with, and what your goals are, so that ultimately we can help you achieve the results that you want. And if it seems like I can truly help you, then I'd love to invite you into the program to work with me. And that way we can get you exactly the results that you want, get you excited to release new music, and put it out in the world for people to enjoy. So once again, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/Amplitude, and you can find all the details there. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end. Can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit MasterYourMix.com.